Go.
Welcome, everyone. It is Inspiring Story Wednesday, our brand new series that Cliff and I get to participate in to share inspiring stories that relate to points that we've been training in many of our groups. And we decided we better record these so we can really make a deeper and a longer impact. And Cliff, you've got an amazing story to start us off with this week.
I do, April, and this is a story that I have told in my coaching for years now, and I know that it has real impact with people, and I'm super excited to bring this to everybody that would like to watch the video or will watch it down the road. So, the story is about connecting with people, and as we know, as habit finder coaches, this is the most important thing that we can possibly do, especially in these times, right?
Absolutely. We are in a unique season.
And it's in the way that we connect with people is changing, and it's changing to something that we actually don't know. But I know that when I'm teaching people to connect with other people, there are some tried true foundational principles that have been around forever and work for forming deep connections with other people. And the story that I would like to bring to you today is really a story that's ageless of how to connect with people in a deep way and how that affects not only your life, but everybody else that you come in contact with.
And it's important to hear the whole story because, as I have heard this a few times now, uh, it amazes me how many people I hear from after you've told the story and how deep the impact goes and how long they spend thinking about the story. So I just want to make sure we set up our audience to make sure they hear the whole thing, right?
Yeah, please listen to this whole story. It gets a little long at points, but you'll understand at the end when I come to the end of the story of why that I have to give you the full story. And
Excellent.
coming from a background of sales and sales management for the last 40 years, we connect with people every day. That's our job and how we do that. And it's always fun when I'm trying to coach salespeople or sales managers, and they always want to know what the secret of my success was. Well, what made me such a great salesperson, or what allowed me to stand on the stage at three industry leading corporations as a top sales rep. And when I tell this story, I think they're shocked. They expect me to come out with some story about some great salesperson that I met years ago who took me under his arm and mentored me through that. Certainly there were those people, but when it really came down and I thought very deeply of how I was successful in sales, it was connecting with people. And when I think of connecting with people, my mind immediately goes to this story. So you let me know if you're ready for me to share it, and I
Absolutely.
will start. So the story is really about my grandmother. Uh, Her name was Carrie Polari, and she lived to a very long life. Let's say she almost made it to 102 years of age. And Carrie, I have to give you her whole life story to understand why she was such a master at connecting with people, forging those deep relationships that we want to have. And some of it is very apropos today because she lived in the early 1900s when the first pandemic was around. And she can even bring us some lessons from the past today that we can use. But I have to start back in the early 1900s. My grandmother was a beautiful young lady, and she grew up in a family, and she met my grandfather, who was about 10 years older than her. He was 10 years older than her, which was very common in those days. She was about 16. He was 26 years old when they met, and he was a craftsman, a shoemaker. Shoe repair was his trade. Neither one of them had educations past the seventh grade, so they could read and write, but they didn't have any formal education past that. They fell in love and got married, and immediately moved to Buffalo, New York, which was a thriving town in the early 1900s. And set up a shop in front of their home in downtown Buffalo, New York, which was very common in the days to have your business in the front of your home. And Carrie worked on the side right by my grandfather at the shop, and they proceeded to have and started their family. And they had 5 children over the course of the next 20 years or so. And as you can well imagine, in the early 1900s or getting into the 1920s and the Great Depression, it was not an easy life. Shoemakers don't make a lot of money, and but they were committed to their family and to having children, which was their thing that day, and they survived. And they survived, and they were very proud of the fact that, one, that they were Americans, and two, that they survived the Great Depression with 5 children and made it through. My grandmother was a strong woman, and it's not in stature or size or anything like that, but she was very strong in helping my grandfather and raise the children. They were an interesting couple in the regards that they soon figured out, they were very smart, they soon figured out the way out of to better life was to become professionals, and the way to become a professional was through education. So they very much stressed education with their children, and the good news is that they all 5 of their children went on to advanced education and all the way up to doctors in education. They became teachers. Most of them became teachers and principals in their life, including my mom, who ended up being a principal of a school in downtown Buffalo. So I think that was great foresight. They also were very active in the community. The 2 of them together started a society to help Italian immigrants come into the United States and learn English and get good paying jobs, because I knew that was the only way that they could do that, was to assimilate into the American culture and part of the American dream. So they were always active in the community. But what does that have to do with making deep connections with people? So let me fast forward life to a time when my grandmother's about 50 years old or so, and my grandfather still has his shop in front of the house, but most of the kids are out of the house now into their careers or have been married and are creating families of their own. And unfortunately, my grandfather walks from the shop into their living room one day, and he passes away from a massive heart attack. And now my grandmother is alone, without any education or job. She has to close down the shop on the front of the house, and she goes to work on the counter of a dry cleaner. And she never works for more than minimum wage the rest of her life. So again, you're saying to me, what does this have to do with connecting with people? And I guess the story doesn't start here, but really becomes powerful when I explain a little bit more about my grandmother as a person. You see, when you met my grandmother, the first thing that she would do, or when I met her, the first thing she would do is she would greet you in a very enthusiastic voice. And it was always a very upbeat voice. And she would say to me, and I forgive this translation if you know Sicilian, because I don't, but to me it sounded like this: Bedu figlia. Okay, and Bedu in Sicilian meant beautiful. That I do know. But the filia part, she's asking her years later, was either son or family member or friend. It didn't matter. Or face. And in my case, when you look at this face, I have not been given the moniker of beautiful much in my life. I would say that my grandmother told me that every day that she ever saw me, and every time she ever met me. Of course, my mother thought I was beautiful. She lied a lot. And then my wife claims that she never did call me beautiful, but I believe she did when I met her at 18 years old. But she disputes that. So it was a very awesome way to meet another individual. I mean, to have somebody call you that, Now, she just didn't do that with me. She did that with everyone she met. Everyone she met. So you had this incredible feeling to start with her. And then my grandmother would typically invite you into her house if you were near her house. And, you know, when you went into my grandmother's house, it sort of looked like a hoarder's house because she had lived through the Depression with 5 children and she couldn't throw things away. So things were in stacks and, you know, God only knows how long they had been there. And there was going to be a purpose for them someday, I'm sure, in her mind. But you'd weed your way through some of this into her kitchen. And she would sit you down at her kitchen table and offer you tea. She was the Starbucks of tea, as I call her, of her day. She loved to have tea with you. And she might offer you something out of the refrigerator to eat or a cookie or something on the table. We, as grandchildren, were always leery to take any food from her because we didn't know how long it was there. Again, she was not going to waste anything. And so, but she would offer you that. And then she would start to talk with you. And one of the things that she would do, which was incredible, was she would always start with what was going on in your life. What was happening to you? What was important to you at that particular moment? So when you were really young, she would talk to you about possibly starting school or a play group that you were in. And then she would, as you got a little bit older, she started talking to you about the relationships and your interests in school, whether it be band or choir or sports. It didn't matter what it was. In her eyes, it was all wonderful and great. And, you know, she continued to ask those questions. Got a little bit older. She started to talk to you about your relationships and who were you dating and so forth and so on. As you got a little bit older, you got to talk about your spouse and then your kids. And it continued through my entire life. And I wasn't the only one. She did this with everyone she met. And then at some particular point during the conversation, she would say something to you like, "Honey, do you mind if I tell you a story?" And it was an awesome point in the conversation because you have to understand, my grandmother lived to almost 102 years old. So she had incredible stories. And she had these wonderful stories about her life and her circumstances. And it always tied into what was happening in your life. And it usually was a positive message that she was trying to give you about, hey, we all suffer through difficult times. You know, we all go through these low periods in our life. And she had plenty of those low periods. 2 of her children died before she died. So she understood and she made you feel like you were understood through her stories, her beautiful stories. And then after that, you typically just felt great and left. So now my grandmother's house, imagine this now in downtown Buffalo, in her neighborhood. She did this with everyone. So literally people would stream in and out of my grandmother's house. And they would come for counsel about things. And they would just come to talk with her, to talk with Mrs. Polari. And she became the matriarch of her neighborhood. She truly became the source where people came with their issues and with life stories. And she was wonderful at that, and people loved her for it. But my grandmother was more than that. My grandmother was also very active in her community. I wouldn't call her an activist, because I don't think she would know even what that meant. But she acted and to help and improve her community, the people around her. So she was president of her Catholic church down the street and was very involved with the church. She also was active in the community organizations around her. And on top of that, she raised a great deal of money for the United Way. She believed that people needed to give back to other people and help them in times of need. And matter of fact, she raised so much money, my grandmother, that the United Way honored her with putting her actually on the poster that was hung in businesses around to promote giving to the United Way. It was that way. Now, the interesting thing about my grandmother in all her activities were that I never knew that she had any of these activities. She never really talked about it. The story I like to tell is I remember, in an Italian family, she'd come to our house on Sunday afternoons. You usually have a large Italian dinner. It's an early dinner. And in Buffalo, if you were Italian in Buffalo, you were a Buffalo Bills fan. So you watched the Buffalo Bills play, and then typically you had a large pasta dinner. And, nobody wanted to do the dishes. But my grandmother would be the first person up, and well into her 90s, would be the first person off the table, clearing and doing those pots and pans that nobody wanted to do. This was probably pre, non-stick diamond
Right.
finishes. So my grandmother would be doing that, and I could always, Graham, what are you doing? She goes, oh no, this is what I do, and then she would usually ask us for a ride home. She lived in the city, we lived in the suburbs. And finally one time I said to Graham, why do you need to go home? What is it that you need to get back for? And she said, well, honey, I go home and I go to the church and I wash the dishes for the church supper. Now, my grandmother was the president of the church. And I looked at her in shock because for years I never knew why she wanted to go home. She never told me she was president of the church. I didn't even know that.
Wow.
She was a servant leader. She was a person that served and connected with people with no wanting of recognition or return. It was just her, and this is what she did. She understood why she was put here, and this is why people loved her so much. So anyways, let's get down the road even further with my grandmother. My grandmother was an absolute force. Everybody knew my grandmother. As a matter of fact, the mayor knew her personally, and I could tell you stories about, him walking down the street and stopping a press interview to talk with my grandmother. She was so loved in her neighborhood. Unfortunately, the neighborhood that she was in started to deteriorate pretty rapidly and became a difficult street to live on. There were a lot of drug dealers, prostitutes.
Life happened.
It was a tough neighborhood, and literally they would sit on the stoop of her house. Yet my grandmother didn't get touched by any of these people. Matter of fact, my grandmother was left alone and admired by them because my grandmother was the matriarch of the neighborhood. She would help and serve them if they needed help too. And her reputation grew. And it grew so much that the city of Buffalo named her one of the senior citizens of the year. She was
That's amazing.
that active in the community and recognized by everyone in the community. So one of the stories I like to tell is I was driving down the street one day, and there's snowbanks in Buffalo, and I used to check on my grandmother because a throughway entrance was made at the end of her street. And so I was driving about 11:30 one day back from a sales call in downtown Buffalo, and I drove by, and there was my grandmother walking. And I always knew my grandmother was walking because my grandmother stopped driving at age 64. So she was on the go. Okay. She was not one to sit around. And so it wasn't a surprise to see her walking down the street. But so I pulled up to her and I rolled down the window. And of course she hit me with, "Babe Ophelia, how are you today?" And I said, "Nana, where are you going?" And she said, "Well, Cliff, I'm going over to Niagara Street." And she said, I have a meeting over there or whatever. And I said, "Well, get in the car. It's cold out." And, Niagara Street was probably a few miles away. So it was not uncommon for my grandmother to walk that distance. But so she got in the car. And as we started to drive, I said, "Well, where are we going?" And, I figured she was going up to there was a really nice Italian deli up there. Maybe she was going to get something special to make for dinner or whatever. And she said, no, I'm going to Rich Foods. Now, Rich Foods is one of the few Fortune 500 companies in Buffalo, New York. It's a privately held corporation. And, Rich Foods? All right, Rich Foods. I didn't question it. You could never really question my grandmother and what she was doing. So we drive up to Rich Foods. By the way, Rich Stadium where the Buffalo Bills played was Rich Foods, if for
Got
the
it.
football fans. Um, and so we drive up to the headquarters building of Rich Foods, and there's portico there, and I look out, and there is the president of Rich Food, the owner of the company. And I turn to my grandmother and I say, Nana, I go, what are you doing here? And she said, as she slipped out of the car, she said, oh, honey, they're just having a little luncheon to honor me, and she was gone.
Wow.
And I was like, again, they were honoring my grandmother, but my grandmother was not one to talk about those things. The honors were not why she did what she did. The honors were nice and she appreciated that, but that wasn't what she was all about, and she certainly didn't broadcast those things to us. So I could go on and on about the stories of my grandmother, and I don't want to bore you to death, but my grandmother was ever present, and not just to her family members, to everyone. My grandmother was there, and she was always working harder and faster than anybody else, ensuring more of herself in her life to help other people her whole life. So let's fast forward. My grandmother reaches the age of 99. She's still living in that house alone. So she was fully functional, all of her mental capabilities until she was 99. And then her heart started to get old, for lack of a better term. And she was moved to a nursing home where she ran the roost there too. She didn't change.
Right.
But my grandmother passes away in her sleep just before her 102nd birthday. She almost made it to 102. Truly a remarkable life, right?
Very.
But the end of the story gets interesting because, we were all, Buffalo didn't have a lot of jobs when we were graduated from college. And so my cousins and I, most of us were moved out into other states. So we had to fly back with our families for the funeral of my grandmother. And as we were at the funeral, people were coming through the door and saying to us, your grandmother, if it wasn't for your grandmother, if your wasn't your grandmother was always there, she was always present, she was such a great person. And they would all come in and say, she would say this thing to me when she first met me. They didn't know what it meant, but they knew it was fantastic. They didn't even know what the words meant, what she was saying to her, but they knew it was fantastic. Why did she always say that to me every night? Well, what she was doing is she was calling you beautiful. And it without even knowing the words, they knew what it meant, which is shocking to me. And what a legacy to leave, right? On top of that, we find maybe 30 or 40 plaques in her house of her being honored for her works in the community. My grandmother didn't hang plaques on the wall. I didn't even know they existed. She had 2 full tables of awards that she was given for her community service. Not once did I hear my grandmother ever talk about those awards, nor did I see them. It wasn't her style. It wasn't what she did that for. Anyways, we get a call from the Catholic Church. And we are assuming that her funeral mass, being that she was Catholic, was going to be in the beautiful church that was literally a block from her house that she was president of for so many years. But instead, the Catholic Church said, we would like to have your grandmother's funeral mass at the Basilica in Buffalo. Now, the Basilica in Buffalo is a tourist attraction church, like St. Peter's in Rome. It literally is modeled after St. Peter's in Rome. It is absolutely gorgeous. And the only people that truly have their funeral masses there are clergy people or mayors of the town, politicians, right? Well-known people, celebrities. This was my little grandmother. And that just shows you how much people thought of her and what kind of status she derived in her life by connecting so deeply with other people, that she could affect people in that way. She was put at the same level as a clergy person. So
She was a living example of connecting with people.
Exactly. Exactly. So, to end the story, there's one last piece of the story, and that is at the end of her life, my uncle was the executor to her will. And it took about 6 months for him to work through the paperwork of the houses that she had and so forth and so on. But he came back to us and had a family meeting, and he sat down with us and he said, I have some news about your grandmother's estate. And he said to us, you see, your grandmother died with over $1 million in the bank. And we were shocked. We were shocked. You see, my grandmother would put 2 cents in the church envelope. And she was not known as spending money, but my grandmother never made any money. I mean, she never had a job that I know that was over minimum wage in her life. So how could this be? How could this happen? And that's the question I love to ask people. But how it happened was by her connecting so deeply with other people. See, when you can connect with that kind of ability, and you can serve people unselfishly, you see, many of the people that she served in that way passed away before she did. Okay? And when they did, they remembered her in their wills. They actually gave her money. And my grandmother didn't need much to survive, right? It was just her. And so, and having lived in the Depression, she couldn't really trust banks, right? Because they failed in her lifetime. So what she did is she did go to the bank because that's the only place she could store it safely. She certainly couldn't store money in her house. But what she did was she bought U.S. savings bonds. She figured the U.S. won't go down, right? And I won't lose that money. And the combination of that and her living style and the fact that people willed her money
Right.
made her a millionaire. Now, I can tell you this. To my grandmother, that money had no meaning to the way that we think of money today.
Right.
Okay? Because her life was all about the relationships she was creating. She understood what was important, what her priority was. And her priority was the love of her family and her friends and her neighborhood and her community. And that's what really made her more than a millionaire. She would be a billionaire in that.
In this day and age, absolutely.
So,
And and to and as you share this story, you watched many of people digest it. And what have you seen as a major digestion? What's the major response that you've gotten?
I think, and I can only guess. I mean, people have told me that this story touches them in so many ways, in so many different, and I think it touches people in lots of different ways. Certainly, we all have a soft spot for our grandmothers, right? They're special people in our life. Unfortunately, I never got to know my grandfather. He passed away before, but I heard that he was just as special of a person, and I wish that. Certainly, I think that's number one. People understand that. But I also think in this time today, it touches them in a slightly different way than usual. And that is we start to think about all the things that we have that they did not have back in the early 1900s. And as our country grew from people all over the world, we start to relate back and think about those grandmothers that, man, oh man, they lived through pandemics. They lived through death and wars that we've never seen and poverty. But they were able to still serve. They were still able to give. They still were able to serve other people. And I think that that's the big message for today. And when I teach it to salespeople, in training in business, I teach this to plant managers, and I teach it to CEOs of companies, and not just salespeople, but everyone. And I think what happens with them is they start to realize, I've got to go back to the roots.
Right.
I got to go back to what's important. I've got to find out and develop those strong relationships with people. That's the key to success in any business. Not just with my customers, but with everyone I touch within the corporation, because literally we're just a community, a shared community, right? It's the same thing.
Absolutely.
It's the same thing.
And I think that sets us up perfectly for our next week. In our next story, you'll have to listen in to hear the next opportunity of how, because one of the things that we both have experienced is people attempt to jump layers. They attempt to get ahead of the process of communicating and learning and listening and being present with people and having the opportunity to truly hear them. And we've got many, many, many more stories to be sharing in that avenue. So we look forward to hearing, we look forward to the comments, we look forward to any suggestions as we continue to build this amazing, simple little story platform every Wednesday. And anything else you want to make sure we share today?
I don't, April. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity and hosting this for me and us together. I think people come back because you're going to hear some more amazing stories if you liked what you heard.
And they're going to make an impact. Thanks, everybody. We're glad you joined us.